close your eyes and picture a night long before words, only firelight, the hush of grass, and glances that carried meaning. How did our ancestors stay alive without language? Tonight, we'll drift back to that world and discover the quiet skills that kept early humans safe, fed, and together. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Settle in, get comfortable, and let the glow of the past ease you toward rest. Before words, survival lived in the quiet space between heartbeat and breath, in the steady practice of noticing. Dawn widened over the grass and rock, and minds woke as the light did, tuned to the slightest change. A bird that fell silent mid-call, the sour note of smoke on the wind, a sudden stillness in insects that meant a shadow passed above. The body listened for the ground story. Grit underfoot, revealing a dry season. A patch of damp coolness hinting at underground water. The faint give of soil where hooves had pressed hours before. Eyes caught patterns that weren't quite patterns until looked at long enough. A branch bent in a direction trees don't choose by themselves. Stones scuffed into a faint line that became a path when the sun raked across it at an angle. Memory held these fragments like beads on a cord, and over time the cord became a map, not drawn, but carried inside the skull, retraced each morning and mended each night. Knowledge moved by looking. If the vultures spiraled low, something lay fresh beyond the ridge. If the vultures hung high and aimless, the land was quiet for now. If the jackals barked at dusk from the same hollow, there was water there. If their voices shifted to the east after a wind change, the water had drawn new drinkers and new risks. The language of the sky was practiced daily without a single name. Cloud bellies stacking dark meant a wash of mud along the ravine. Thin feathers of cirrus at sunset promised a cold that would harden tracks by morning. Even darkness spoke. The way stars rose from the horizon, marking seasons and routes. The way the moon's tilt put silver on a trail, and then took it away again. Hands learned the textures of safety. A leaf that polished smooth against the skin belonged to a plant that had always made the tongue burn. The bark that flaked in thin curls split easily for tinder. The brittle stalk that snapped clean at a certain height promised hidden tubers a few arm lengths away. Tongues knew bitterness that warned, sweetness that welcomed, and the particular starchy flatness of food that kept a body walking. Smell became compass and calendar, rain arriving before clouds gathered, a den musky and warm even when no paw prints showed, crushed mint along a riverbank where people could drink carefully and rub the scent on wrists to go quieter into the tall grass. Attention worked like a net always cast and always hauling. The mind skimmed the surface of the world without forcing it, gathering small, repeating cues that stitched together into predictions. When reed beds shivered in a windless pocket, hippo backs would rise soon. When spider silk tilted across a path, no one had walked here since the dew set. When termites flew at dusk, fish would feed at dawn. No one needed nouns for this knowing. Practice made associations, and associations made tomorrow less uncertain. Children learned while being carried, lulled by footfalls and the soft rhythm of breath, watching the horizon bob up and down, eyes tracing the outline of far hills that would later live inside their memory as anchors. Later, walking themselves, they learned to hold a place in the head from several angles at once, like turning a stone in the hand to feel each facet. The group's eyes were a single instrument. Someone watched the ground, someone watched the mid-distance, someone guarded the back trail, and someone watched the sky's edge where heat made the air flicker. Quick glances were signals more precise than whispers, a slowed blink to acknowledge a sound heard by two people, a chin tip for direction, a low shoulder for caution, a widened hand to hold everyone in place. Joint attention, the act of noticing the same thing at the same moment, was a rope thrown across the unseen. It pulled minds together where words had not yet been braided. Safety lived in that rope. So did food. When one gaze snagged on a glint, others followed, and the glint became a water seeping from stone, or the polished shine of a rib cage in the grass, or the eye of a cat watching from the shade. Paths were not lines, but stories retold by feet. The best routes threaded shade just when the day began to bite. They found a breeze where the flies were worst. They cut across fan-shaped spreads of hoof marks to step where the ground was firm. A bad path had a feeling, angles that made the legs tighten, echoes that swallowed soft sounds, a smell of old fear. A good path revealed itself in small gifts, a fallen bird's nest for kindling, a stand of berries masked by thorn, a slope that led the knees downward without strain. Each time a path was walked, the mind laid another filament of memory over it, until the way existed inside as surely as outside. Even in new country, the mind searched for what it already knew. The way a river bends around stone like a familiar wrist, the way light collects at the mouth of a valley, the way ungulates choose a contour that looks like others once chosen. Analogy did what vocabulary would later do. It compared and recognized and decided. Silence was not empty. It was stuffed with meaning. When moving through tall grass, quiet wasn't merely the absence of noise, but a pattern of controlled attention, weight on the blade of the foot, breath slowed. Pauses synced to wind gusts so that the grass's hiss covered the shift of stems. Beads of sweat rubbed away before they could fall and tap leaves. The world answered such care with permission. Birds resumed their chatter sooner. A hair froze and became a shape that could be skirted gently. The air cooled enough in shade to signal that rest would be useful here, now, before the worst heat. Rest itself was a skill. It kept the eyes clear and the mind unclouded, able to see the tiny difference between old spore and new, between the twilight grey of an ordinary rock and the particular grey of a sleeping cat. Teaching meant showing and letting the land speak. A child's hand was guided to the edge of a print and then withdrawn, so the eye, not the fingertip, learned to read. A stone was placed near the ear so the faint tick of hidden water could be heard before it was found with digging. The direction of an ant line was followed only part way, then abandoned to see if the child's gaze could find it again on the far side of a route. In this way, attention became portable. It did not depend on a teacher standing nearby. The world itself became the teacher, its habits observed, its surprises filed away, its borders respected. Over seasons, minds accumulated a thick felt of if this, then that. If figs are ripening low in the valley, bees will be heavy near the ridge. If the morning has a bitter cold, the midday sun will be sharp enough to dry the low crossing by late afternoon. If thunder wanders without rain, move high, because swamps will hold heat and mosquitoes. Danger was a rhythm as much as an event. Predators hunted on their own schedules, and bodies learned to match those schedules with absence. When lions favored the river mouth at dusk, people favored ridge lines where wind carried scent ahead of them. When leopards took to the fig trees during a scarce week, fires were made in circles small and low, and sleep rotated in thinner slices so no one drifted fully under. Fear, properly placed, sharpened rather than paralyzed. The body acknowledged it like weather, then used it to sharpen the eyes and slow the feet at just the right places. Courage lived not in confrontation, but in calibration, knowing how close to water one could approach before crocodiles had the advantage, how far onto a plane one could step before one became too visible against the sky. Even play rehearsed survival. Children threw seed pods at marks on a trunk and learned distance. They chased each other in zigzags that copied the erratic sprint of a spring hare. They hid in the in-between spaces, behind a termite mound, under the droop of a branch, and learned how landscape breaks sightlines and buys time. Laughter rose and fell as naturally as bird song. And then, when a parent's posture shifted and a hand spread wide, laughter folded away and the game became stillness, everyone breathing, everyone noticing. until the parent's hand dropped and the day resumed. In all of this, minds were not empty bowls waiting for names, but quick, patterned instruments that made sense from sensation. The world pressed in with touch and light and smell and faint tremors underfoot, and the mind answered with attention, memory, prediction, and choice. Without vocabulary, people still combined clues and saw ahead. They read the land like a pulse, felt their place within it, and moved according to what it said. And every evening, as the sun lowered and shadows grew long, the same minds that tracked hoof marks and wind shifts lifted to the slope of the sky, counting familiar lights, tracing the thin road of the Milky Way, letting the slow precision of the stars remind them that roots repeat, seasons turn, and tomorrow will offer new signs to notice and follow. Hands spoke first, long before tongues braided sounds into words. A raised palm steadied a rushing child. A curled finger beckoned someone to see a hidden track. Two fingers pointed like the fork of a river to show a choice ahead. Gesture became a shared field where meaning grew quickly because bodies already knew how to mirror, how to match, how to pause at the same time. The tilt of a wrist said wait, a flattened hand near the earth said low, and a sweeping arc drew the idea of a circle around a camp that did not yet exist, but soon would. In the quiet hour before dawn, when breath steamed in the cool and the fire hissed softly, hands rehearsed the day's possibilities around the embers, small pantomimes of crossing a ravine, of skirting a thorn thicket, of dividing a group with taps to shoulders and nods to horizon points that would later become footholds in the mind. Posture turned the whole body into a sentence. A spine lengthened to mean alertness, knees flexed to mean approach softly, hips angled toward a ridge to say, there, while eyes stayed on the ground to avoid drawing others' attention prematurely. Shoulders carried grammar, rolled forward for caution, squared for resolve, lifted toward ears for a warning that wind carried something strange. Even the way weight settled on the feet communicated. Heels heavy meant holding ground. Toes light meant ready to move. A foot placed deliberately on a stone spoke of silence needing to be kept. Within groups, rhythms emerged. A leader did not need a title, only a way of moving that others trusted, a smooth pace that saved energy, a knack for picking lines that kept people shaded, a habit of glancing back just often enough that everyone felt carried along without being dragged. Eyes were bridges. Meeting them for a fraction longer than ordinary said, "You see what I see." Cutting them away quickly said, "Danger, do not look." Narrowing them toward the edge of vision pulled a companion's gaze to a particular clump of grass, where the shape was not quite grass. Widening them while holding breath press the group into stillness without a sound. Children learned these choices of gaze as naturally as they learned to balance. They watched how adults looked at the world, grazing over the near ground to find tracks, then jumping distance to the skyline to check for movement, then lowering to the hands to fix a sandal thong or rearrange a basket. They practiced with play, locking eyes and darting away, discovering how a glance alone can launch a chase, hiding with a giggle, swallowed into a closed mouth when a parent's eyebrows climbed in exaggerated question. Hands held a vocabulary that could expand without limit. Touching thumb to two fingers meant two. Thumb sweeping along the fingers meant many. And tapping the same finger repeatedly meant more of that kind. A palm facing down and wobbling meant uncertain. A palm cupping the air meant hold, keep. Fingers combing outward from the chest meant share. For threats, signs were sharper. Two fingers crooked like fangs meant snake. A flat hand chopping near the knee meant tall grass. A hooked hand sketched the curve of a horn for an antelope. Knuckles rapped twice on the skull meant remember. Rapped 3 times meant this time beware. To coordinate hunts, hands drew moving maps. One traced the path of wind with a lazy line. Another marked a semicircle that a pair would travel. A third speckled dots for cover spots. A termite mound here, a shaded boulder there. No one needed to count seconds. Instead, they counted heartbeats together, wrists pressed lightly, feeling the pulse align before they drifted into position. Gesture bled into tool use and back again. Demonstration was a form of speech, showing how a stone strikes at an angle that flakes a clean edge, showing how a reed twists to make cordage, showing how a torch lifted higher sends smoke ahead to stir sleeping insects away from a path. An elder would slow their hands until the movements became visible frames, each frame large and clear enough for others to copy. The learner's hands mirrored, fumbling until the right muscle music arrived, then smoothing into the same tempo. Repetition carving sense into sinew. Praise was quiet, a palm pressed to the back of the learner's hand, a brief squeeze at the wrist, a soft exhale through the nose. Corrections were just as gentle. A finger nudge to shift a grip, a slight rotation of a wrist, the whole hand guiding the arc of a swing without a single sound. Tactile language ran deeper than skill. Comfort traveled through touch that was specific, not general. The slow circles between the shoulders that settled a frightened child. The firm whole-hand hold at the forearm that brought a grieving friend back into breathing. The rhythmic palm-over-palm press on a tense thigh before a difficult crossing. Grooming was not only about removing burrs and sand. It stitched relationships. Each small pick and brush and smoothing stroke said, "You belong with us. You are watched over. Your skin and ours tell one story. The order of who groomed whom and when shifted with need, not status, so that tired people found hands waiting for them as they sat, and watchful people found their hair braided tighter before a night of guarding. Clothing and ornaments were also a form of speaking. A particular knot in a cord announced a long walk ahead. A strip of bark tied at the knee reminded of a healing wound and asked others to set a pace that would not tear it open. A smear of pale ash across a forehead softened the skin against sun, and also in the face duller to eyes that hunted movement. People carried scents as messages, smashed mint at the wrists to pass through reed beds, dust rubbed into hair to disguise the sharpness of soap root after washing, crushed leaves tucked in a sling to announce, "We passed here, follow." Even the arrangement of possessions around a fire communicated. A basket placed between two sleepers meant the food was for morning and not to be touched in the night. A digging stick leaned at the entrance of a shelter with its point up signaled that someone was nearby and would return shortly. A child's toy, a smooth seed pod, set on a sleeping mat, promised the child that the mat was theirs, even while they were off at play. At distances where hands could not be seen, whole-body silhouettes handled the task. Against a ridge, a figure crouched for stay hidden, stood tall for safe, swayed side to side for look for movement, and made slow arcs with both arms to mark the path of an animal. In brush, where only bits of a person appeared, an elbow here, a hat of leaves there, the rhythm of appearing and disappearing carried intent. A quick flash meant urgent. A long hold meant fix your eyes here. Two flashes separated by a pause meant confirm you see. At night, firelight created a second language of shadows. Hands near the flames threw signals onto boulders. A triangle shadow for a shelter shape, a moving line for a river, a circle broken by a slash for a waterhole with crocodiles. Youth sat rapt, learning both the signs and the pleasure of making meaning with nothing but light and motion. Silence was carried as deliberately as speech. A group that needed to pass close to a den moved like a single organism, breathing matched, feet placed in the same footprints to keep sound minimal. Burdens shifted to soft materials to muffle rubbing. Ankle bracelets removed and tucked into belts. Even the small accidental noises had antidotes. A snapped twig was answered by 3 soft taps of a stick on soil. Tap, 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 to tell scattered companions stop and listen, and also to mimic the random knocks that wind sometimes makes so that predators nearby might not sort the sound into human. Coughs were swallowed with water sipped from hands. Sneezes pressed against the inside of an elbow. Laughter, a needful, irrepressible thing, was allowed to bloom later, away from risk, in places where echoes would carry the joy back to camp rather than outward to teeth. When words were few or absent, time coordinated meaning. People built schedules into gesture. A hand circling twice around the wrist meant 2 suns. A finger tapping at the brow at midday shadow meant when the shadow is smallest, and a hand shading the eyes while head tilting to the west meant as the light falls. Seasons had their own signals, a string with knots that moved one place each day, tracked how long fruit would remain sweet. A line scratched in ash and extended after each successful forage told the group when to shift camp. A bundle of reeds with one reed broken served as a quiet promise that a group would return to a watering place once the moon thinned again. These were agreements made visible, promises that traveled even when people were apart, and reminders that memory could be helped by objects. Conflict was softened with the body long before words would later tangle and untangle disputes. An apology looked like lowering the head, opening the hands, placing a tool within reach of the offended person, and then stepping back to give them the decision. Forgiveness was a finger's light touch to the shoulder, and a shared task resumed. 2 people bending to lift a heavy branch, or sitting side by side to crack nuts, the rhythm of work smoothing the roughness between them. When frustration rose, the group knew how to dilute it. A different pair would trade places. The pace would slow. A child would be given a role slightly too important for their age, so that pride displaced fretfulness, and the small recalibration of bodies freed minds from the tight loop of annoyance. Dance and game encoded shared signals into pleasure. Evening brought footbeats, claps and sways that repeated patterns useful by day, speeding up together, starting and stopping as one, leaning and returning, circling and crossing. Young and old learned to feel the group's balance, who was drifting toward the edge of the circle, who needed to be gently pulled back, who carried extra energy that could be welcomed at the center. In the pattern, there were layers. A lifted knee might imitate the hop of a bird the group liked to snare. A quick folding at the waist might copy the bow one makes under thorn. 2 people spiraling in opposite directions might illustrate the safe way to avoid collision in thick brush. This was story and rehearsal at once, joy braided with instruction. In all of this, the body remained an open book written in muscle and light. People woke and read each other each morning. Stiffness in someone's gait meant a quieter day. A bright quickness in another's hands meant they should carry the flint. A child's heavy eyelids meant someone would tell the slow kind of story while walking, using gestures broad and comforting. As the sun climbed and shadows shortened, meaning continued to pass without voice, hand to hand, eye to eye, shoulder to shoulder, every signal a small bridge, every bridge making the day safer, every shared motion, turning the group from many into one that could cross open land, approach water, harvest sweetness, and thread danger by keeping the air between them dense with silent understanding. Before words took shape, sound moved like water through the day, filling the spaces between bodies and landscape with small, purposeful currents. A low hum steadied a group as they walked, a shared vibration that kept pace even when feet found different textures. Sand here, stone there, cool mud by the river. The hum told everyone where the center was without calling attention to it. It made a soft rope of rhythm that hands didn't have to hold. When the air sharpened with risk, that rope tightened into a narrow thread of sound, a breathy click against the teeth, quick and light, slipping between grass stalks without bouncing far. A pair of soft, spaced clacks meant look. 3 closer together meant listen. A single dry pop meant stop. None of this needed names. The throat and tongue were tools already skilled from eating and breathing. They learned to place tiny sparks of noise exactly where they would be most useful and least costly. Not all sounds were warnings. A rounded whistle, shaped with lips barely parted, rolled ahead like fog to test whether a path carried echoes. If the whistle came back thin and fast, the way was narrow and stony. If it returned full and slow, a clearing was close. When foragers fanned out within sight but not touch, each kept a signature motif, 2 low notes, then a high one, or a quick trill followed by a pause. Little sonic names that said, "I'm here," drifting through leaves and weaving the group together while hands were busy. Infants slept to the oldest instrument, breath. A caretaker's exhale, drawn out and even, guided the tiny lungs to match it. Sometimes a tone sat on that exhale, barely voiced, a lull that blurred the edges of waking. This was more than comfort. It was timing. A sleeping child meant quieter steps, a narrower sound profile, a safer approach to water or shade. Alarm had flavors. The long, thin hiss that slid from the mouth and pushed through teeth meant snake. A harsh, tearing rasp against the palate meant cat. A flutter of tongue that scattered like pebbles tossed in a pan meant many feet moving quickly. Urgency changed tempo rather than volume. The same pattern delivered rapidly tightened muscles without attracting distant ears. The same pattern stretched out, invited calm scanning and slow, careful looking. Sound traveled in shapes the land understood. In tall grass, a purring burr skimmed along stems. In dry gullies, a tapping tongue set small echoes that hopped the bends. Under trees, a soft cluck rose and broke gently among branches refusing to carry farther than it should. People learned to lean sound the way they leaned bodies, into wind to blur scent, into foliage to rub away edges, into bark to swallow percussive ticks. Imitation was a fluent dialect, a ground hornbill boom, voiced from the chest and released in measured pulses, told companions, move wide and slowly, while also borrowing the bird's ordinary authority, so that predators heard nothing unusual. A high, thin, meerkat-like peep asked for attention without causing alarm, a useful midday call that aligned eyes without tightening shoulders. Sometimes a human whistle answered a starling flock to stir insects, or a soft clatter of teeth pretended to be beetles in leaf litter, coaxing lizards into showing themselves. Mimesis made the world a collaborator. It bent existing soundscapes just enough to help without tearing them. Silence was shaped as much as sound. People held breaths together at the edge of water so that ripples from nostrils didn't betray them. They swallowed saliva before stepping onto pebbles because a swallow's click rings in the head and changes foot timing. They scheduled coughs with the wind, letting gusts roll over vegetation and cloak the throat's mistake. Night carried everything farther, so the language changed. Calls knotted into short, deep murmurs that stayed local. A hand over the mouth pushed tone into the palm and out between fingers in a soft fan. The chest sent vibrations through a log to pass a message without lifting into open air. A stone tapped gently under another stone drew two tiny notes that felt like the random cooling tick of rock rather than the regularity of a human signal. If someone stumbled and gasped, the nearest person layered a barely voiced tone over the gasp. Two sounds together, confusing the predatory ear that listens for isolation. Work made music because music organized work. Nut cracking found a steady beat. Knock, knock, pause. To save wrists and share pace. Digging took a longer cycle. Push, pull, rest, sung by a low hum that kept spines from rushing. Carrying logs floated on call and response sighs. One person breathed out on lift, others slid their breath to match, and the log rose as if it wanted to. Children learned to enter these patterns the way they learned to enter a stream, testing a foot, feeling how the current pulled, then finding the line where effort and flow agreed. Pleasure lived there, but so did economy. A group moving to shared sound used less, did more, and arrived with eyes still sharp. Signals for close danger hid inside ordinary noises. A hand slapped lightly at a calf as if brushing a fly. But the three rapid pats were code for freeze. A throat cleared as if from dust, but the small rise at the end of the sound meant look left. Feet scuffed in a rhythm that matched grasshoppers, the third scuff heavier, told everyone to step exactly where the leader had stepped. Even laughter, when it burst free, contained cues. Its edge, softened by a quick, breathy ha, added at the end, told listeners no threat behind this, and people relaxed without spending time to look. Later, that same laughter might be used deliberately to drape safety over a moment that wasn't entirely safe. Letting a group pass without presenting the high-contrast silence that can trigger interest from watching eyes. Mouths learned to place clicks like seeds in space, forward on the lips to mark near things, deeper on the palate to mark far things, sharper against the teeth to point at thin, precise dangers like thorns or scorpions, tongue-shaped edges of meaning by changing where they touched, as if drawing a map inside the mouth that corresponded to the ground outside. The jaw opened wider to pour out a broader warning. It narrowed to thread sound through narrow cover. Noses joined in. A forceful, silent exhale communicated irritation or impatience. A quick sniff, repeated twice, pulled attention to scent without saying of what. A long inhale held near another person became a question. Do you smell this too? And when both nodded, the group made a small, correct turn toward shade where a carcass might lie. Distance asked for different tools. Across a valley, a conch-like bellow shaped with cupped hands carried like a drum roll. Along a cliff, a clack of stones sent syllables skipping across sheer faces, each skip a marker that companions could catch and answer. These were maps in time rather than space, lines drawn with intervals. A long gap meant far. A tight run of taps meant close. A pattern repeated twice meant confirm. Even without agreed numbers, people counted, because bodies count naturally. Heartbeats, breaths, paces. A message might be, move 3 breaths to your right, delivered as 3 soft tongue taps following a low hum, or wait 5 heartbeats, given by a hand placed lightly on a shoulder and pressed in time. Food had sounds the way weather does. Honey seekers sang a thin, rising thread to soothe bees while the smoke drifted. Diggers whispered air into holes to listen for echoes of tubers. Fishers fluttered lips to make surface ripples that confused tiny swimmers long enough to scoop. Around the fire, voices stayed warm and round, protecting darkness with tones that hugged the ground rather than climbed. Stories were told with pitch arcs that mirrored the curve of landscape, low for valleys, higher for ridges, and listeners' heads moved as if walking those contours. Teaching happened in the music of repetition. A short phrase hummed nightly, changing slightly as a lesson deepened, until children could hum the next note before hearing it, and later act the next action before being shown it. Weather edited everything. On windy days, signals thickened so gusts wouldn't shred them. In fog, calls slowed so the damp air could carry them without smearing. Under blistering sun, sounds hugged shade because heat pushes high frequencies away. People tune themselves each morning with small vocal checks, 2 soft notes to test throat and air, a click to check teeth, a whisper to test how far a breath might travel, and by those checks decided how to speak the day. Bodies that had slept poorly made rougher tones. Companions answered with smoother ones that took the lead, letting the group's sound settle into a useful average. If someone needed quiet, others made more. If someone carried a fragile mind, others braided sound around them. A hum at the hip, a low note from behind, a whistle ahead that gently tugged the attention forward like a kite string. Even grief and joy spoke in ways that helped survival. Grief's moan at a careful distance allowed the group to discharge pressure without inviting scavengers. Joy's whoop was wrapped in hand claps and foot stamps that blurred it into dance rather than discovery, hiding new abundance from ears that might arrive uninvited. In both, the body found the same truth. Sound can carry feeling without betraying position. Over time, certain melodies became signals wrapped inside comfort. The 4-note fall that meant we are together. The 2-beat rise that meant share. The quiet oscillation that meant sleep now. Each lodged in muscle memory, ready to surface when backs ached and the air smelled of wet stone and dawn began to unroll its pale road across the ground. Fire gathered people the way water gathers into a pool, drawing bodies into a soft ring where warmth held the night back and light turned faces to moving maps. The flames flickered and edited the world, bright here, dim there. So attention naturally fell on hands and eyes and the small dramas of making and mending. Around this circle, imitation became the great teacher. A napper lifted a river stone into the orange glow and turned it slowly, showing its grain and the invisible lines he felt with his thumb. He set it on a thigh and struck not hard, but true, the blow traveling like a thought from shoulder to wrist to stone. Sparks leapt. A flake slid free, as clean as a crescent moon. He paused in the quiet after sound, letting watchers fix the angle in their minds, then struck again, 6 breaths later. So those breaths became part of the lesson. The timing that saves fingers, the patience that saves stone. Food turned the fire into a language of sharing. Tubers were raked from coals and brushed clean with bundled grass. Fat dripped, hissed, and taught where heat lived under ash. A piece was turned once, twice, never 3 times, and the rule needed no naming, because everyone could see how it kept the outside from charring and the inside from staying hard. Children watched the order of gifts, first to the hungriest or the oldest, then to the watchers who had kept the edges, then to the ones who would rise early to fetch water. When a child forgot and reached, A quiet hand rested on their wrist until the right moment arrived, and then another hand slid a piece their way with a small nod. In this rhythm, fairness wore the face of timing. The circle learned that hunger and patience can live together, and that the appetite of one is steadied by the presence of all. Smoke stitched the ring to the sky. In the blue dark above, sparks lifted like tiny messengers and went out, and elders traced their travel with a fingertip, then slid that finger farther to the hard stars and drew roots in shadow across the constellations. The path to the dry valley was a tilted line that mirrored the belt of 3 bright lights. The way the river hooked east felt like the curve of a faint cluster near the horizon. No words, only hands and gasps and the soft ah of breath when recognition clicked. Sometimes a palm covered a child's eyes and then opened, and the child's gaze climbed where the palm had been, finding the exact star the hand had hidden. In this way, directions were hidden and revealed, and memory bound itself to the night in repeating patterns that could be summoned later, far from fire, with a lifted chin and a gesture no wider than a moth's flight. Tools multiplied under the choreography of firelight. Cordage twisted from plant fibers learned the rhythm of left over right, right over left, the wrist turning with the same measure a drummer might prefer. Glue from plant resin and ash thickened to the right shine, the exact moment caught by the shared silence when everyone sensed readiness. Bone points were smoothed against sandstone, dust falling, edges catching the light as if drawing lines across small moons. When mistakes happened, the cord kinking, the resin burning, the flake shattering, corrections arrived as brief touch, a pinch to flatten a twist, a lift away from heat, a finger placed on the core where the next blow should land. Failure itself made its own lesson pile, a quiet cairn of not quites that taught the hand to want better without shame. Stories flowed without sentences. A hunter showed the day by reenactment, shoulders hunched under thorn, hand brushing the hair on the forearm to mean the breeze from the south, a sudden crouch and a sprint traced in half steps around the fire. Others joined, taking the roles of spoor and shade and distance, the circle becoming a landscape everyone could walk together. Laughter ran through when a child played the part of a river with such seriousness that water felt almost present, the child's arms swinging as waves, their knees bouncing as stones. Sorrow sat there too, when a hand paused over an empty patch of ground where the shape of a friend should have been. The pause said what voices might later say, "We carry them by carrying their part." In that pause, the fire leaned and the night listened. The fire's edge was a classroom for small skills that don't travel well in daylight's bustle. Fingers learned the telling temperatures of ash, this warm, this hot, this dangerous. Hands felt the difference between tinder that only looks dry and tinder that sings when it catches. Eyes learned to read the pitch of flames to gauge wood, quick and blue at the base for acacia, taller and yellower for softer fuel. Coals were banked with care, their red hearts tucked under sand so morning would find embers waiting, a reminder that good nights make easier days. The person who knew where to leave the ember learned to lay it like a secret gift, and the person who found it learned to lift heat back to flame with nothing more than breath and patience. Watching those two acts, a gift hidden and a gift unwrapped, children felt how community extends forward in time. At the farthest edge of the circle, guardians moved with a different tempo. Their eyes tuned to darkness rather than firelight. Their breath matched the wind's push. Their hands cradled embers in shallow bowls when a small light needed to step ahead to test a path. When danger pressed closer, two glints at knee-height, a ripple of grass against the wind. The guardian's shoulders squared in the fire's glow, and the ring tightened. A stick lifted, a pebble thrown just wrong to annoy rather than challenge. A hush that flattened the camp like a hand smoothing a blanket. All of it practiced 100 evenings and never felt rote. Children studied the detail others missed, the way a watcher shifted from kneel to squat to save their knees, the way a second watcher placed a hand on the first watcher's ankle to say, "I am with you," without pulling their gaze. The way the third watcher counted breaths so that someone remembered time when vision narrowed. Firelight turned faces to pages, and the pages were reread until everyone knew the plot. A scar on a wrist replayed a lesson about thorns. A calloused thumb told of days spent braiding. A burned forearm, long healed, told of the wrong angle of a pot set too far into coals. Hands reached across and traced these marks with permission, learning shapes that mapped to choices. When a newcomer joined, their marks were read gently, and the circle shifted to include what those marks meant. A talent for hearing small animals in leaf litter, a knack for reading clouds, a habit of stacking wood in a way that made catching easier. In this way, biography turned into a plan for tomorrow. Games grew in the cracks between tasks. Pebbles were flicked at targets drawn in ash, the arc judged by the small gasp that followed a near miss. Shadows on stone walls became animals to be hunted with fingers. Riddles without words challenged eyes. One person built a scene from bits of charcoal and bone, and others had to track it, pointing out the clues. A line that stood for a trail, an arc that stood for a shelter's mouth, a circle that meant a waterhole. Success brought the prize of getting to build the next scene. Failure brought the kinder prize of learning to see what had been overlooked. Nothing was wasted. Even play thickened the pattern of attention. The night itself collaborated. Fire snapped sometimes, and that snap taught everyone to flinch less. Embers fell and taught quick toes to brush them aside. A moth blundered into the flame and threw a new shape onto a rock. And someone pointed, and soon the shape turned into a story of how not to be drawn to the wrong light. Owls called from a thorn tree and made a low ceiling to the listening. And under that ceiling, secrets were shared in the form of demonstrations. How to find water with a reed held lightly to the ground. How to wake a scorpion without angering it. How to pick a fig by feeling the give at the base rather than looking at the color. Some evenings the lesson was to do nothing at all, to sit and let warmth soak into bone while muscles unlocked and thoughts cleared into the kind of quiet that sees better in the morning. Objects took on roles in this school. A particular stone, flattened by years of pounding, lived by the fire and was used for cracking nuts and loosening roots. Its familiar weight carried comfort, and the dent in its middle taught a child where to place a shell so the blow struck the correct line. A gourd with a thin crack taught gentleness and fixing. A bone comb with missing teeth taught turning a fault into a new function. A sling with knots dyed dark marked the number of nights one should wait before moving the camp. The knots moved along the cord, the movement done ceremonially, the watching eyes making it official. Signals for the next day were set with these things. Stick leaned against stick to point a direction. Ash brushed into a drift along the ring to show wind expectation. Small piles of seeds placed in different positions to share who planned to forage with whom. Even the way the fire was fed delivered meaning. A person added thick wood when the circle needed to stay long. Thin twigs when talk turned to rest. A twist of resin when tools required more light. A shovel of ash when heat had grown too greedy. The fire answered, brightening plans or dimming them, tilting the night toward weaving or toward sleep. As coals settled, someone who knew sleep's door hummed a low, even line, and others fell in with breaths, a loose braid of sound that softened the edges of minds. Eyes drooped, hands slowed, and the last tasks found their finish. A blade was sheathed, a pot pulled to the ring's edge, a child tucked so that toes faced the fire and heels caught the heat. Watchers changed places with watchers, the transfer done by touch, wrist to wrist, a squeeze that carried the count of hours in it, and the circle shrank slightly, but did not break, the warmth marking the center even as darkness reclaimed the world beyond the glow. In this warmth, the next skills were always waiting. How to split a log with wedges chosen by their quiet song when tapped, how to scrape a hide smooth by holding the scraper just so, letting light reveal when the nap lay correctly, how to sort seeds by listening, shaking a shallow bowl until the full ones spoke in a heavier rattle and the empty husks in a dry hiss, how to hold a baby near the fire without letting smoke sting their eyes, by standing in the fire's lee and lifting the child when the wind shifts. The fire gave each of these acts a stage and a tempo, and people filled it with the choreography of survival, movements learned by seeing, repeated by doing, sustained by the calm agreement that to watch well is to care well, and that every glowing coal can be persuaded into flame again with breath, patience, and a circle of hands already reaching. Meaning thickened slowly, like sap turning to resin, as sounds, gestures, and shared habits braided themselves into something that could be carried farther than the moment. At first, it was rhythm, a repeated pattern of taps before crossing water, a hummed rise that always preceded dividing the group, a fall in pitch that reliably meant enough. Repetition shaved off confusion. Predictability invited trust. A child who had felt those rhythms nightly around the fire began to anticipate them by day, and anticipation is the doorway to naming. A soft click and a low hum together came to mean the sweet tuber found under certain leaves. A hiss, followed by a lip pop, meant the thorn thicket to be skirted. The combination could travel from one mind to another, without the plant or the thorn being present. And that was the beginning of words. Bodies did not abandon their speaking. They scaffolded the new with the old. A palm still skimmed low to say crouch, but now it was paired with a breathy syllable that repeated in later minutes when hands were busy and only the sound could pass. Two fingers still forked to mark a choice. Now a double click taken from that shape began to serve as a portable sign for two, and then for pair, and then, with more seasons, for any idea of two-ness, two people sharing a task, two paths, two dangers. These small abstractions didn't arrive as leaps. They accreted, each reuse polishing an edge, each success encouraging the next experiment. When a pattern worked well for one family, visitors borrowed it. When it failed, silence swallowed it again, and the group returned to the older bridge of eye and hand until a better sound presented itself. Mouths learned to carve contrast so that meaning would not blur. A lip-rounded ooh rolled toward things that were round or far. A tight E squeezed toward things that were thin or near. The affordances of the body taught phonetics before anyone knew the word. Deep chest notes felt heavy. High palate notes felt small. Sharp tongue plosions felt like the pop of seeds. Soft nasals felt like the smear of mud. The mapping wasn't precise, but it was reliable enough to gain traction. By aligning sound feel with world feel, early speakers made a glide path for memory, letting new forms settle into the same grooves as older sensations. Children caught these grooves quickly because caregivers exaggerated them, stretching vowels and slowing the pulse of syllables the way a hand slows when showing how to place a stone. That sing-song, the first cradle of speech, amplified differences, and difference is what meaning needs to stand. Sequences became recipes. One small noise pointed at kind, the next at size, the next at motion, and soon listeners could assemble a scene without seeing it. Animal, big, moving away. Slowly, order began to matter. A swapped pair changed emphasis, a doubled element intensified. A clipped ending hinted at urgency. No agreement was ever carved into law, but practice was law enough. Day after day, success pruned the thicket of possibilities into trails that everyone could follow at walking speed. In that pruning, a primitive grammar budded, not the rules of books, but the constraints of breath and attention and need. A group that had to move while talking grew a preference for quick, front-of-mouth syllables. A group that had time by the fire let syllables lengthen and stack, opening room for finer distinctions. Names took hold where repetition and care converged. A bay that saved lives in dry season earned a sound like its wind. A cliff with a sleeping lion's profile took a sleepy vowel and held it forever. A person who moved like water carried a liquid consonant on their back until their children wore it, too. Names did more than mark. They pulled distant things into the circle. One could speak the bay while walking inland and feel the air cool a little. One could speak the lion cliff while crossing the plain and feel a shoulder tighten in useful respect. In saying the place, people rehearsed the route. In saying the person, they kept track of who was away and who would return. Counting advanced by touch and chant. First, fingers, 1 bent, 2 bent, 3, then pebbles laid in a small groove, then notches on a stick smoked to keep them from wearing. Then a string of knots moved along with each dawn. Sounds attached themselves to these marks so they could travel without the objects. Brief syllables marbled with the beat of a pulse. Quantity escaped the immediate. A forager could hum a pattern that meant, "We need 4 hands at first light," and those who heard it prepared before being told again. Later, the hum and the knots found each other, and the same compact form could mean 4 of anything. 4 drinks, 4 snare checks, 4 nights. Abstraction didn't explode. It crept, win by careful win, until ideas could be carried as lightly as breath. Rituals did patient engineering on the edges of sound. The same call and response at dusk before sleep. The same circle of sounds to open a hunt, the same syllable tied to the first coal lifted each morning. These rehearsals stabilized fragile forms. A shape shaped nightly resists erosion. Children learned the liturgy by pleasure, not force. Pleasure made it sticky. When new syllables wanted to join, ritual offered a doorway. They entered at the same slot in the sequence, displacing a gesture little by little, and if their fit made sense across moons, they stayed. This was cultural selection under stars. It let communities tune their shared signals to changing environments without losing themselves. Contact with strangers pulled language across gaps. Two bands met at a waterhole and paced like cautious dogs, heads tilting, hands open, eyes scanning for shared ground. A pebble was lifted, a gourd shone, a tuba offered. Sounds hung in the air like trial stones, some falling, some catching. Where meanings overlapped, hybrid forms formed, half gesture, half sound. Where they didn't, trade filled the lack. Objects carrying the weight that a word could not yet bear. On the next meeting, the successful bits came back brighter, trimmed of confusion, easier on the tongue. Pigeon-like bridges appeared long before anyone carved shell or painted overhangs. Each bridge was also a test of tolerance. Tolerance kept roots open. Open roots kept ideas moving. Over generations, some borrowed sounds settled and bred. Others remained seasonal visitors, useful in a pinch, not part of the home tongue. As sounds gained reach, memory found new anchors. Knots and notches were joined by pigments dabbed in familiar patterns on skin and stone, a visual echo of spoken sequences. A spiral painted near a camp meant circle back, and the word for circling wore the same cadence. A row of dots near a well meant count carefully, and the counting chant matched those dots beat for beat. The world became a score to hum by. When camps moved, echoes remained. Scuffed lines, stained rocks, a particular arrangement of fire, black on a boulder. And the next group could read them as footnotes to the air's stories, confirming, correcting, or extending what their own words suggested. With greater reach came the need to soften and steer feeling. Sounds learn to carry tone, soothing fall to calm, playful rise to entice children into a task, firm flatness to close argument without tearing fabric. Gossip sprouted as a tool for cohesion, not just pleasure, a low, conspiratorial rhythm that let people check reputation without attack, preventing one person's roughness from blooming into risk for all. Praise developed its own music, light and quick, and it moved through camp like sunlight through leaves, encouraging the behaviors that made days smoother. Slowly, sound's cargo shifted from there, then, this, to should, could, why. the small beginnings of reasons offered and choices weighed together. Little mouths pushed the frontier. Infants bubbled with syllables that adults repeated back, selecting by imitation which forms would be rewarded with smiles and food and arms. The back and forth, a game at first, became the engine of refinement. A child might say "ba" for many things that bounce or bulge. Adults would narrow by context, giving "ba" only when the gourd was wanted, not the stone. And over weeks, "ba" would tighten, and then fork, and then coexist with a hand sign long enough for the sound to stand on its own. Caregivers used frames, short, singable templates, to drop new pieces into. 2 beats for calling, 3 beats for sharing, 4 for warning. Templates made learning cheap. Cheap learning meant more could be learned before hunger, heat, or fear demanded attention elsewhere. Structure invited stories, not just enactments around firelight, but spoken strings that could run in the mind while feet were moving. The strings carried recipes, how to build a trap, how to cross a swamp, how to survive a sting. And they also carried patterns of cause and effect. When the cloud sits low and the flies are sweet, then the fig will be soft. So go early, sung to a rising line, hummed while packing baskets, remembered at the tree with hands already ready to squeeze. Stories stitched similar days into a single long day that could be consulted. In that stitching, time itself grew a vocabulary. Soon, later, before, after, again. These were not calendar words. They were attention words, telling minds where to stand while looking at the flow. The mouth and the hand learned to dance rather than compete. Gesture carried the heavy frame, a path traced in the air, a size sketched, a distance marked, while sound slotted in specifics. Which path, what size, how far. Over seasons, the specifics dug channels for themselves and needed less scaffolding. The hand could rest more often, the tongue could carry the load longer, and minds could wander a little while, still keeping up. That slackness mattered. It gave room for play, and play is nature's workshop. Jokes appeared, delightful mismatches of sign and sound that reset attention without cost. Riddles took root, practice at holding 2 possibilities and choosing. Song layered on top of instruction, turning hard tasks into dances with a chorus. Through all of it, the web tightened until a person could be guided by voice alone, through darkness to water, through danger to cover, through grief to a seat by the fire. Taboos and veils formed wherever sounds reach threatened safety. Names for certain animals were not said in their season. They were replaced by nicknames that tripped differently on the tongue, so that creatures might not learn the sound that meant their hunting. Sacred paths acquired circumlocutions, spoken only at dawn or only by elders, a way of shaping attention without summoning competitors. The practice of avoiding direct naming had a side effect. People learned indirection, and indirection is a lever for thought. It allowed minds to hold an object by its relationships rather than its surface, to plan around absences, to negotiate without collision. Politeness grew out of caution and then served cooperation, making space for more speakers to thread their needs into the shared weave. As toolkits thickened, words began to grip not only things, but actions and qualities of actions. A flake could be quick or clean. A strike could be true or wasteful. A path could be kind to feet or jealous of ankles. When talk could judge, practice could improve faster than imitation alone allowed. The community became a mirror, reflecting back efficiencies and frictions, and makers chased the brighter reflection. Soon, the words for better makings became objects themselves, portable advice that could be carried to new materials and new problems. Transfer blossomed. People who had never seen a particular tree could understand how to approach its wood, because they already had a word suite for other woods that cracked, flexed, or drank glue in certain ways. At the edges of camp, pigments kept pace with phonemes. Fingers trailed ochre across stone, not to depict perfectly, but to prompt the right words in the right order. A line to start the travel chant, a hooked mark to recall how to skirt the marsh, a burst of dots to trigger the counting rhyme, marks outside, murmurs inside, and a root appeared in the mouth that feet could then follow. When rains faded, the marks the community refreshed them, and while refreshing, refreshed the words. This maintenance, half art, half rehearsal, reduced drift, the way rope twisting in the evening reduced fray. People who had been away could read themselves back into the circle. Children who had been too small last year could now track the line and learn the syllables tagged to each bend. Even the air learned to expect the tongue. Birds whose calls had been mimicked stopped spooking at certain human whistles. Scavengers, hearing a newly standard forager call, arrived at just the right delay for sharing to be safe rather than costly, and that delay worked because both sides had learned the clock of the other. Feedback loops formed between voice and world. Sound shaped environment. Environment shaped sound. Meaning grew in the middle like a reed bed fed by two streams. As bands split and met again, as droughts pushed roots into fresh stone, as children with new mouths tugged at old rhythms like puppies at rope, the system flexed without snapping. What began as breath on wind had become a fabric that could stretch over the day, the season, the memory of the dead, and the plans of the unborn, holding warm against the chill of uncertainty, letting people carry more than their hands could hold by carrying it together in patterns their voices could make and remake whenever the need rose like dawn at the edge of the plain. As the firelight fades and the night settles, let your mind rest with the quiet skills our ancestors carried: attention, touch, and small sounds guiding them home. If this journey eased you toward sleep, whisper alike, subscribe for more gentle history, and share where in the world you're watching from so our circle can grow. Thank you for being here, and until the next story, breathe deep, sleep well, and I'll see you in the past again soon.